Greetings, comrades! So, are you ready to dive deep into the depths of conspiracy theories about Russia? We are already at the lowest levels, which means the stories here are becoming more and more fascinating and unbelievable. Today we'll be discussing miners' folklore, underground private prisons, Lenin's secret will, and of course, how your own house could have killed you in the USSR. Phenolic Houses. What if I told you that some 9-story prefabricated buildings constructed during the Soviet era are literally killing their residents? I'm talking about the standard 249p buildings that were erected in many large Soviet cities in the early 1970s. Soviet engineers were constantly working to speed up construction. And so, in one of their experiments, builders used a new additive to strengthen the concrete in the walls: phenol formaldehyde resin. This was supposed to speed up the hardening process and thus bring forward the completion date of the buildings. To reduce production costs, the same resin was also added to the insulation, which was made of ordinary technical wool. A total of around 250 houses were built in Moscow using this technology. But for some reason, no one took into account that both phenol and formaldehyde are extremely toxic to humans, with phenol being carcinogenic. They also failed to consider that as the concrete ages and begins to crack, toxic fumes would escape into the street and people's apartments. In 1991, independent experts declared buildings number 24/1, 24/2 and 24/42 on Открытое шоссе and buildings number 3/1, 3/2 and 3/3 on Nikolai Himushin Street unfit for habitation. Some residents of the upper floors were relocated, but those who remained continued to experience the harmful effects of the toxic substance. Smelling its characteristic slightly sweet pharmacy or gouache odor, which intensified in warm weather. Allergies, coughs, complications following colds, eye disease and high blood pressure were familiar symptoms to almost everyone here. After many years of rallies and protests, residents finally achieved their goal in the mid-2000s, when the phenolic houses of the 249p project were demolished. But here's the catch. The authorities officially recognized only a few houses as dangerous and demolished them, mainly in the Metrogorodok district of Moscow. Not even all of the houses in the 249p series were demolished. For example, it was believed that phenol formaldehyde had only been added to the standard grey-painted houses, not the beige ones, and that everything was fine in the remaining 200 houses in this series, with no exceedance of permissible standards, but the residents do not believe this. And then there is the 249d series. According to official data, phenol formaldehyde was not added to these buildings, but in fact, such a decision could well have been made by local engineers in order to speed up construction. Buildings from these two projects were constructed throughout the Soviet Union, and virtually no official data on them exists outside of Moscow. Instead, there are only rumors and horror stories about the terrible deformities of children born in such phenolic houses. Phenolic houses remained an urban legend throughout most of the country for a long time. But in 2022, the Russian Ministry of Construction suddenly proposed to include houses with excessive concentration of phenol and formaldehyde located in the Khanty-Mansiysk Autonomous Okrug in the state housing program in order to organize their resettlement. So it suddenly turned out that phenolic houses are not just a few experimental buildings in Moscow. At the end of 2021, there were 235 phenolic residential buildings in the Okrug, and this is only one region of the country out of 90. Moreover, it can take decades from the moment of inclusion in the state program to the moment of resettlement. So, just in case if you live in such a house, order a test to check the concentrations of phenol and formaldehyde in the air. I mean, what if your own apartment has been slowly killing you for years? Bourget. In 1973, the pride of Soviet aircraft manufacturing, the first supersonic passenger airliner, the Tu-144, crashed at the Bourget air show in France. This was undoubtedly a huge blow to the prestige of the USSR, as the Tu-144 crashed in front of the whole world immediately after attempting to repeat the stunt of its main competitor, the Franco-British Concorde. After performing several maneuvers and flying over the runway at low altitude, the Soviet airliner suddenly dived and literally fell apart in the air in front of 250,000 spectators. The burning wreckage crashed into the town of Guzeville below, killing 6 pilots and 8 people on the ground. A Soviet-French commission spent a year investigating the disaster and concluded that everything was fine. There was no sabotage, all the equipment was working properly. However, while climbing, the pilot of the airliner was startled by the Mirage 3 fighter jet flying overhead. He fell and jerked the control column, causing the plane to dive. It then broke apart due to overload. However, as there is no material evidence to support this, the cause of the crash must be declared undetermined and the case closed. Naturally, few people were satisfied with this official report, and alternative versions of events began to emerge. Firstly, what was the French Mirage doing in the demonstration flight zone? Officially, it was filming the number of spectators at the air show. Or was it there to spy on the Soviet airliner? Something about its unique front retractable wings. According to another version of events, the pilots had agreed to bring a French television camera into the cockpit and film the flight. However, when the plane turned away from the Mirage, the engineer lost his balance and dropped the heavy camera. This blocked the steering column and prevented the pilot from pulling the plane out of its dive. There are also versions related to human factors. According to the first one, the Soviet authorities sent an unfinished airline to the air show, which simply could not repeat all the tricks of the Concorde. But in order to maintain the prestige of the USSR, the pilot was given an order to repeat them at all costs. In the second version, the pilots decided to perform a zoom climb maneuver to surpass the Concorde, but the aircraft could not withstand such high G-forces. Furthermore, examination of the wreckage and flight recorders revealed that the main voice recorder had not been activated prior to takeoff, and the test oscilloscope recorders had been destroyed. The emergency voice recorder was also destroyed. Supporters of the theory that the pilots performed an unplanned maneuver believe that the recordings did exist, but that Soviet representatives secretly removed the tapes and took them to the USSR to hide the true cause of the tragedy. Zatvarka. There is a conspiracy theory popularized by the live journal blogger Barnaul City Dweller. It is more of a mega theory combining many others at once. It claims that certain monsters who control the world are poisoning people with certain chemicals, polluting the air, adding substance to the water and so on, in order to stupefy them and change their human nature. This process is called zatvaривание. The word Zatvarka comes from the word tvari, which means something between a creature and a beast, that is, not a human being. So zatvaривание is something like creaturing or beastification. And to be creatured means to become dehumanized, to turn into an obedient monster. According to this theory, certain inhuman parasites are preparing to emerge from the shadows and are poisoning humanity for this purpose. Their goal is to turn as many people as possible into creatures and bring about an apocalypse on the planet. Who is responsible for this zatvaривание? All world leaders and heads of state have long served the creatures and undergone horrific cannibalistic initiation rites. Who's assisting them? Everyone. Scientific and medical centers, transnational food corporations, pharmacists, religious leaders, the media, scientists, they are all in cahoots. Their task is to get the Zatvarka, which consists of parts of the blood and internal organs of already infected people, into our bodies. How? In any way they can. Chemtrails in the sky, vaccine components, Coca-Cola, gluten additives in food, HARP, all means are fair game. Even religion is a tool of zatvaривание. Have you ever wondered why many religions worship the relics of saints or visit tombs? It's because it's the easiest way to spread infected biomaterial to the masses. But that's not all. To conceal this terrible plan, global spectacles are periodically staged. They claim that all major terrorist attacks, wars and disasters never happened, and the video footage features actors. all top bloggers, astronauts, famous actors and athletes are required to support the official version in order to intimidate us and distract us from the real threat. So you will be creatured by them if you don't defend yourself. How to? Oh, the list is huge. Keep your umbilical cord blood from birth, drink only breast milk, never get vaccinated, avoid holy places. Don't eat products from corporations, don't use a microwave, give up drugs and alcohol. An interesting fact, smoking natural tobacco is okay, it supposedly protects you from creaturing. But cigarettes are not okay because they are pseudo-tobacco, saturated with Zatvarka. In short, no matter how hard you try, they have almost won. And soon there will be only creatures left on the planet. Too sad. Rostov Oblast serial killers. In the last episode I talked about the theory that cannibals are suspiciously common in southern Russia. Do you know who else is common there? Serial killers. Not just in the south, but in a specific region of Russia, Rostov. There is indeed an anomalous number of them there. So many that by the end of 20th century the term Rostov Triangle of Death had emerged. The area between Rostov, Taganrog and Shakhty saw at least 37 serial killers active over a 30-year period from the 1970s to the 2000s. An absolute record for Russia. The most famous of these maniacs is Chikatilo, but others such as Yuri Tsuman, nicknamed the Black Tides Killer, Zaven Almazyan and Vladimir Mukhankin were no less terrifying, and together they killed more than 150 people. While Rostov is indeed a large transport hub with many potential victims and it's easy for a killer to hide there, this alone cannot explain such a monstrous concentration of evil in one place. Criminologists, psychiatrists and scientists have been trying to solve the mystery of the Rostov Triangle of Death for decades, and they cannot. The only thing that doctors studying Rostov serial killers were able to determine was that most of them had an average of 15 to 17% less gray matter in their frontal lobes than normal people. This region of the brain is believed to be responsible for empathy. In addition, all of them had difficult childhoods and/or had injuries during their early years. But this explains how they became maniacs, not why they became maniacs here. The theory of geopathogenic zones has gained great popularity. It is said that the Rostov region, characterized by faults in the Earth's crust, a large volume of groundwater and a huge number of springs, represents a unique site with favorable conditions for committing crimes of a sexual nature. Another theory is that electrical discharges have a negative impact on people and their psyche. The Rostov region is typical of southern Russia, characterized by powerful thunderstorms, and such natural phenomena often provoke exacerbation even in healthy people, not to mention those with deviations. Another version suggests that certain dark forces dwell underground and control these murderers. The fact that the Rostov region is a network of little-studied underground labyrinths, some of which are vast and multi-level. It is said that a certain dark energy originated there. Incidentally, Chikatilo himself once confirmed this theory when he stated that he felt the support of dark forces during his crimes. If I had to choose the most plausible explanation from all these versions, I would lean towards the water theory. Some believe that the increased aggression and viciousness of criminals was influenced by the region's unfavorable environmental conditions. The water supply in Rostov in the 1980s and the 1990s contained high levels of heavy metals and pesticides. Coal slag heaps and mining waste could have had a destructive effect on the criminal's psyche. Furthermore, some of the Rostov maniacs had a connection to poisons. One lived near the Kamensk chemical plant and another's mothers came into daily contact with toxic chemicals. However, there is a much more mundane explanation for the Triangle of Death phenomenon, which has to do with statistics. Researchers suggest that the Rostov region took murder statistics very seriously, partly due to the high-profile Chikatilo case, which reverberated throughout the Soviet Union. Additionally, the local police force gained extensive experience in tracking down serial killers. In other regions, some crimes were not recorded in order to avoid spoiling the statistics, or the killers could not be caught. So the number of serial killers in Russia is roughly the same everywhere, but they were most effectively tracked down in this triangle. Mayakovsky was murdered. In the last video, I quoted Vladimir Mayakovsky's poem about a Soviet passport. He was one of the main heralds of the young Soviet state, its poetic star, but at the age of 36 he shot himself in the heart. According to the official version, he had an unsuccessful 1930, was denied a visa to France, experienced a creative crisis, fell out of favor with the authorities, was plagued by quarrels and scandals, and his mental state became increasingly unstable. The man just couldn't take it anymore. He wrote about this several times in his diaries and prepared a suicide note. Moreover, there is even a witness to how he shot himself in the heart, his last love, actress Veronika Polonskaya. So where do the theories about murder come from? In fact, several things cast doubt on the idea that the mouthpiece of the dictatorship of the proletariat took his own life. Actually, Polonskaya did not witness the gunshot, she heard it from the front hall of the house. When she ran to the poet's room, she found him lying there with a bloody stain on his chest. The investigator's report stated that Mayakovsky had shot himself in the chest with a Mauser, but it was later established that the bullet had come from a different pistol. The suicide note was dated April 12th, not April 14th, and was written with a pencil for some reason. Most importantly of all, there was the poet's shirt. When it was examined decades later, no traces of gunpowder were found on it. This suggests that the shot was fired from a distance rather than at point-blank range, as is usually the case with suicide. The OGPU conducted the investigation and closed the case too quickly. It was overseen by the prominent Chekist Yakov Agranov, who was having an affair with Lilia Brik, Mayakovsky's lifelong muse. Agranov was known as the executioner of the Russian intelligentsia. He was already responsible for the murder of the great poet Nikolai Gumilev. There is a theory that some Chekists shot Mayakovsky in the heart and left through the back door, while Agranov planted the suicide note. But why kill the poet of the revolution? Precisely because of the disagreements that had begun with the Soviet authorities. Or maybe the murder was ordered by Brik herself and her husband Osip, who were afraid that Mayakovsky would break up with them for Polonskaya and they would lose his money and fame. They had just left Russia to secure an alibi, and they were connected to the secret services. They even had their own Chekist ID numbers, 15,073 for Lilia and 25,541 for Osip. Or could Polonskaya herself, with whom the poet had quarreled that morning and refused to let her go to rehearsal, have shot him accidentally or intentionally? Of course, we will never know the answers. Shubin. Kind Shubin, or simply Shubin, is a very interesting character in Donbas folklore. The owner of the mine, lord of the local underground riches, and patron of miners. He looks like a cross between an old miner and a gnome, and is known for his waywardness. He can help a miner who has lost his way in the tunnel or warn of a collapse, but he can also lead people astray, scare them by banging a pickaxe on an empty wall, or even harm those he dislikes. There are many versions of the origin of this character. One says that when the first mines appeared, a young worker named Shubin worked in one of them. One day, a tragedy happened to him. There was a collapse in the tunnel where Shubin and several other miners were working. Everyone died except Shubin, whom the mine owner blamed for everything that had happened. Fleeing from the angry and unjust cries of the relatives of the deceased, he hid in the mine. Either he hanged himself or blew up the mine with himself inside. Since then, the ghost of the young man, now greatly aged, has been wandering the mines of Donbas. Another version of the story tells of a mining engineer named Shubin who worked at one of the Donetsk mines at the end of the 19th century. He had a supernatural ability to predict accidents. Before each shift, he would descend into the mine to listen for any signs of danger. One day, however, he failed to return from such a trip, and since then, the ghost of the aging mining foreman has been said to wander the Donbas mines. In Kryvyi Rog, there is a legend about a machinist named Shubin. At exactly 12 p.m. and 12 a.m. in many Kryvyi Rog mines, a noise of unknown origin echoes throughout the mine. It is similar to the sound of an electric locomotive and can be heard in even the most distant and forgotten working phase. It is said that a machinist named Shubin disappeared without a trace in one of the mines along with his electric locomotive. Consequently, when miners hear the noise and look at their watches at 12 o'clock, they often exclaim, "Shubin has come." They know that at this time they cannot be alone in the mine, otherwise Shubin may take them away with him. In any case, at some point the Donbas underground mines acquire their own master. Miners are not particularly afraid of Shubin, but they respect him. There's a whole ritual. When descending into the mine, you must share part of your lunch with the master, leaving him either a piece of bread with lard or a cigarette. Seeing Shubin means receiving either fabulous help or a black mark, a warning that death awaits you. Beletsky's notes. Imagine the height of the atheist Soviet Union. A prominent academic and literary specialist receives an assignment from the Communist Party to evaluate anti-religious propaganda materials produced by the Soviet government. In response, he secretly writes a memorandum asserting that, for any historian with even a modicum of knowledge, the fact of Christ's resurrection is indisputable. This document, known as the Memorandum of academician A.I. Beletsky, is one of the strangest literary mysteries of the Soviet era. Spanning dozens of pages and citing a vast array of ancient sources, the respected scholar proves that Jesus Christ did indeed rise from the dead. First appearing in samizdat in the 1960s, it gained enormous popularity in the 1990s after being published in various Orthodox materials. One indisputable fact added to its credibility. Academician Beletsky was open about his faith and was even a church warden in the 1920s in Kharkov. However, in all other respects, this document is clearly a fake. Not only could Beletsky not have written anything like this, it would have caused a huge scandal, but none of his 230 sources of evidence for the resurrection are properly cited, and the academic's arguments simply do not stand up to scientific scrutiny. The only questions left are who wrote this forgery, why they did so, and how it came to be so widely believed. Experiments at Butugychag. Butugychag is perhaps the most terrifying of all the GULAG camps. Located on the Kolyma River at the edge of the earth, it is surrounded by the most horrific conditions imaginable. A uranium mine, piercing winds, bare rocks, and eternal frost. However, in the late 1980s, the world was shaken by even more terrible news. In addition to the uranium mines filled with corpses, there is allegedly a much more frightening secret in Butugychag: the findings at the local cemetery. Skulls dug out of graves were scattered randomly across the cemetery. They all had one strange feature in common. The upper part of their skulls had been neatly sawed off. The first publications on this subject appeared in the late 1980s, when a photo exhibition by the controversial émigré photographer Sergei Melnikov, entitled "Accusations Against the USSR for Experiments on Humans," was held in Khabarovsk. The photographs presented at the exhibition gave rise to the terrifying hypothesis that a special laboratory existed in Butugychag in the 1940s, where inhumane experiments were carried out on prisoners. According to Melnikov, a former camp employee told him about a certain object number 14, a former laboratory building next to the main camp. The employee did not know what happened there, but he knew that the facility was guarded with unprecedented security. 9 checkpoints, guards with dogs, machine gun nests on the hills, and even its own airfield. Melnikov even claimed that under an agreement with the KPB, Hitler's special brigades were trained and gained experience there in the mid-1930s. However, even if we dismiss this part of the theory as fiction, the sawed-off skulls remain. Valery Kuzmin, a Khabarovsk forensic expert who studied the Butugychag skulls, stated in his 1989 report that the saw cuts were the result of anatomical examination of the skull and brain. Former Kolyma prisoner Hassana Niyazova also said that doctors dissected the prisoners' bodies. The most harmless explanation for all this is that the sewing of the skulls was perhaps a standard post-mortem examination of the cranial cavity, and that the pathologists from the object number 14 were studying the effects of radioactive exposure on the camp prisoners. But again, these are all guesses. Perhaps someday the declassified archives will reveal the autopsy reports of the Butugychag prisoners, and then one more mystery of the Soviet GULAG will be solved. Russia is a Katechon. What is Katechon? In Greek it means the one who holds back. In Christian theology, it is the final power, whether a state or a ruler, whose mission is to prevent the coming of the Antichrist and delay the end of the world. It is the final barrier preventing the world from the triumph of ultimate evil. Throughout history, the Roman Empire and then Byzantium were considered the Katechon. After the fall of Constantinople, the concept of Moscow the Third Rome emerged. The idea was that Russia had become the last stronghold of the true faith and the restrainer, the Katechon. Incidentally, this theme was also raised in the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which we discussed earlier. In that text, the Russian monarchy is named as the only restrainer against the global Jewish Masonic conspiracy. Following the 1917 revolution, Russian emigres believed that the restrainer had fallen and that the Antichrist was near. They thought that only the restoration of the Orthodox monarchy in Russia could save the world. After the collapse of the USSR, this idea returned to Russia. For example, Alexander Dugin, a philosopher you probably know, embraced this term. Over the years, this concept has found its way into the official text of the Russian Orthodox Church, the speeches of Kremlin political analysts, and the rhetoric of some traditionalist politicians. Recently, it has essentially reached the state level to explain foreign policy. Russia is now fighting not just the West or liberalism, but the forces of hell itself. Former President Dmitry Medvedev explicitly wrote that Russia's sacred goal is to stop the supreme ruler of hell, whatever name he uses, Satan, Lucifer, or Iblis. Thus, the notion that Russia is the Katechon is no longer a fringe conspiracy theory, but rather an integral part of state rhetoric and ideology. Why? It transforms geopolitical confrontation into a holy war, giving the state's action a higher sacred meaning. Very useful. Copenhagen bunker. It is one of the most mysterious stories of recent years. Imagine, 44 kilometers from St. Petersburg, somewhere in the forest, there is a semi-abandoned cottage settlement. Then, one day, a looter who has been scavenging in these abandoned buildings calls the local newspaper 47 News. He said that he had found something so shocking in one of the houses that he couldn't keep quiet about this. Journalists arrived at the scene and were stunned. The concrete garage floor of one of the houses was actually a hydraulic-powered structure that lowered the slab and opened a passageway to the basement. The passageway ended at the iron gate, bearing the inscription Copenhagen above it. But the most interesting part was yet to come. Inside was a security post with the remains of a video surveillance system in a corridor. Further on were 3 prison cells. The cells looked as if they had been cut out of a detention center, complete with bunk beds, toilets and wash basins. There were also strange drawings on the walls, one of which referred to a criminal organization called Mononera, which was involved in extortion and kidnapping. There was also a banya on the side with a hatch leading to a furnace the size of a person. Journalists suggested that it looked eerily like a crematorium. The article about the prison was published at 10 a.m. Exactly 1 hour later, at 11 a.m., heavy machinery arrived and blocked the entrance to the bunker completely. The police's official comment was even more shocking. They claimed to have known about the prison 2 years before the journalists did. However, despite a year and a half of investigation, they never found anyone who could have been held there. They also failed to determine who owned the private prison. Numerous expert examinations did not reveal any traces of people having been in the bunker. The owner of the site swore that he had bought the house as is and knew nothing about the underground facility. However, the journalists decided to investigate further and discovered something. According to their information, the first owners of the facility, which appeared between 2010 and 2012, were a deceased former FSIN employee and a businessman. Until 2010, the businessman's surname was Makarchan, but then he changed it to Escobar. He was tried for kidnapping in 2001 but was acquitted. The funny thing is that building a private prison on your property isn't illegal. Who knows how people like to entertain themselves? Therefore, the investigative committee found no grounds for a criminal case. However, it's clear that such structures aren't built and then abandoned on a whim. Who was kept there and why? The problem is that if you really want to kidnap and hold someone, you don't need to recreate a Russian prison for them. A dark basement is enough. Here, however, everything, including the reception room and the numbering of the cells, numbers 20, 21 and 22, despite there being only 3 cells, was designed to make the prisoners believe that they were in the real Kristy detention center. One theory is that this was necessary so that people who found themselves in this room would believe they were in prison. Frightened by this situation, they would agree to fulfill some condition. Various theories have been put forward, ranging from it being a training base for private military companies or a way to intimidate drug couriers, to the most exotic theory, a private correctional facility for the children of wealthy parents. However, the main mystery in this story is not who built this prison and why. Rather, it is why the police, who had known about it for 2 years, were so quick to cover up all traces as soon as the story became public. Local residents are convinced that investigators know perfectly well who owned the prison, but for some reason decided that others should not know that. Lenin's Will 2024. Officially, Vladimir Lenin's will refers to the document Letter to the Congress, which Lenin dictated at the end of 1922 while he was ill. There was nothing sensational in it, only a series of harsh, almost venomous characterizations of his comrades. The most famous one was about Stalin, who concentrated immense power in his hands, and Lenin was not sure whether he would always be able to use this power with sufficient caution. But the main thing is that Lenin did not name a successor in the letter. The subsequent power struggle between Trotsky, Stalin and other figures led to serious political repression and internal strife within the party. For decades, a legend about another, real will lived on in conspiracy circles. Allegedly, this document was sealed with an order to open it exactly 100 years after Lenin's death, in 2024. Supposedly, Lenin named his successor in this document, which his entourage disliked so much that they hid it. Stalin, after coming to power, did everything to ensure that it was forgotten. Supporters of this theory believe that once the true will was opened in 2024, the process of restoring the USSR based on correct Leninist principle would begin. The only problem is that by the time I reached this level of the iceberg, 2024 had already come and gone, and of course, we never saw any secret will. Post-Soviet genocide of Russians and Ukrainians. The theory states that after the collapse of the USSR, the secret Jewish Masonic world government, represented by its vassals, the US and Israel, decided to crush the last pockets of resistance in the form of the 2 largest Slavic peoples, the Russians and Ukrainians, by pitting them against each other and carrying out other insidious actions to destroy them. That's about it. Funeral superstitions. Have you ever wondered why mirrors are covered in a house where someone has died? Or why a glass of vodka is placed at a memorial service that no one drinks? Because that's the way it should be. Since ancient times, different regions of Russia have had hundreds of superstitions and customs related to funerals and commemorative rituals, some of which are truly terrifying. In the Bryansk region, for example, there was a tradition called spending the night over the deceased. All the women in the family had to sit around the coffin and read prayers until 6 in the morning. In the Smolensk region, people used to tell fortunes using the deceased body. The body was placed on a bench covered with straw. On the day of the funeral, the straw was burned. If the smoke went toward the house, it was a good sign. However, if the smoke went toward the field, trouble was expected because the deceased would start taking relatives with them. Other fortune-telling methods included measuring the deceased's feet. If the left foot was longer, it was believed that death would come for a woman next, if the right, for a man. In the Voronezh region, the deceased's hands and feet were tied the night before the funeral and only untied when the body was carried out. The meaning is obvious. Our ancestors were terrified that the deceased might rise and disturb the living. In general, death was not sudden for our ancestors. There was a tradition of preparing one's own funeral in advance. Feeling the end approaching, the elderly would wash themselves in the banya, put on clean clothes, lie down on a special bench, and spend their last hours there, sparing their loved ones unnecessary hassle and fuss. Many of these rituals seem strange to us today, but some have become firmly established in modern life. Everyone knows that mirrors must be covered in a house where there is a deceased person, so that the soul of the deceased does not get trapped in the mirror. After the coffin is carried out, it is customary to wash the floors, symbolically washing death out of the house and erasing the deceased's path back. At the memorial service, a glass of vodka and a piece of bread are placed on the table for the deceased. It is not customary to clean glasses because the memorial service is not a celebration. Spoons are used instead of forks so as not to accidentally prick the soul of the deceased, which according to popular belief is still nearby. Even the cemetery has its own rules. After the funeral, you must leave through a different gate to confuse death and prevent it from returning home. Pregnant women are not allowed in the cemetery because it was believed that a restless soul could enter an unborn child. And of course, the main prohibition: never take anything from the cemetery. No flowers, no objects, otherwise you will bring death into your home. Central bank is the part of the fact. There are many conspiracy theories surrounding the Federal Reserve. Even in the US, many people do not understand what it actually is. A strange semi-public, semi-private structure that influences the lives of every American but is not elected by anyone. The same can be said for the Russian Central Bank. People find it hard to understand why the country's main bank is legally independent and not required to coordinate its decisions with the president or the government. If an organization is not accountable to the government or the people, then to whom is it accountable? The official answer is boring. The central bank is independent, so the government can't force it to print money non-stop, driving up inflation. This is a global practice, not just Russian. However, some believe that no organization is completely independent. Independence from one's own authorities means dependence on others, namely on the US Federal Reserve and Western financial elites. At first glance, their evidence seems convincing. At one time, the Central Bank of Russia transferred a significant portion of the country's gold and foreign exchange reserves into US government bonds. It appeared as if Russia were voluntarily giving away its savings to support its main geopolitical adversary's economy. Why? It's simple. The Central Bank of Russia is not a sovereign body, but rather an extraterritorial institution, much like the US military bases in Europe. It's essentially a branch of the Federal Reserve, which is controlled by Western oligarchs. Its goal is not to develop the Russian economy, but rather to purchase American debt and ensure the dominance of the dollar, and to do so at the expense of us, ordinary Russians. But then why did the West rob its own branch in 2022, taking $300 billion from it? Weird. Thanks for watching, and as always, a huge shout out to my biggest supporters: Елизавета Zakharova, Kirill Klimuk, Petr Ilich, Marina Holiday, Lyudmila Ilyanova, and one more member who wished to remain anonymous. See you guys next time.